Chapter 25. Mirror Mirror, the Gardens and Self-Sufficiency Movement focus in Santo Domingo was a success. So much so, in fact, that new options that had once only been considered as secondary goals were now on the table. Many of the newer wave of Night City politicians and local media believed that the self-sufficiency movement and popularity of the community gardens would be a flash in the pan before people moved back to the algorithm-based systems of entertainment. When they continued for the next 2 years with no sign of slowing down and only grew with the seasonal bounties of crop yields, Fox began to push for additional options that would help people focus their efforts at home so that the gardens could be available for people outside of the district. So it was that Alan, Jessica, and I were at a fundraiser one cool Saturday evening. The area had been set up in a way that tried very hard to look like something it wasn't. Bright lights hung in twisting strands between temporary poles, casting warm tones over the ground that still carried the dry, stubborn memory of dust beneath the packed dirt. The event organizers had laid down artificial grass in wide rectangles to soften the space and emphasize the general goal of the area's efforts. But it only took a few steps to feel where the illusion ended and the real ground began. Folding tables lined the perimeter, covered in cheap but colorful fabric. Food vendors had been brought in, lining the perimeter of the event. People who had benefited from the changes over the last few years. There were stalls offering grilled meats, others with flatbreads and vegetables grown in the community gardens, drinks mixed from fruit that hadn't been common in this part of the city a few years before. It was part celebration, part exhibition, displaying the results of the purpose behind the gardens and Santo Domingo's focus on allowing its citizens the ability to help themselves. Underneath it all, there was a quiet understanding shared by everyone there that this wasn't just charity. This was helping to build infrastructure. It served as proof of concept. People were taking the chance to not only show off the fruits of their labor, but what they were able to produce with it. There was joy, pride, and a real sense of wonder and excitement, as people not only offered up their goods, but enjoyed the products of others, all while knowing it all came from a source grown and made locally, by locals, and with no involvement from corporations who might sully or tamper with the end product. It was a wonderful opportunity for not only showcasing what could be done through the gardens, but also help raise funds for the expansion of the efforts. The fundraiser itself was dedicated to bringing hand-pump wells to individual homes across Santo Domingo. The reasoning was that with individual wells, each home could become its own self-sufficient garden and homestead. It would also allow for the homes to provide fresh water in the case of power outages, which could be caused by sandstorms. Also, with Santo Domingo's locals having water accessed from wells on their property and encouraging them to start their own gardens at home, this would free up space in the community gardens for people outside of the district to come in and begin participating more. The goal was to make it so that more people could take part in the movement, even if they weren't from the district or lived in an apartment that didn't have room for, or allow, personal gardens. I stood off to the side of one of the food lines, hands tucked into the pockets of my coat, watching the way people moved through the space. They laughed, talked, bartered in that casual way people did when they felt secure in a market they knew was friendly. They praised the produce, food, and other products that were made available, traded ideas and discoveries on how to get different results from various crops. There was a comforting rhythm to it that hadn't been in the air just a few years ago. The culture had changed, and with it came a sense of camaraderie where there simply hadn't been one before. Alan stood beside me with a plate full of food, looking far too pleased with himself for someone who hadn't done anything except show up and eat. "You're staring again," he said around a mouthful of food, his voice light. "Just observing," I replied, not taking my eyes off the mingling crowd. Observing, right," he chuckled. "That's what we're calling it now." Jessica let out a small hum from my other side, arms crossed lightly, as she scanned the area with far more critical eyes. "It's working better than I thought it would," she said after a moment. Like the admission had cost her something. I wasn't sure it would last. "Oh, please," Alan shook his head. "It was always going to work. You just didn't think it'd last in this tech-heavy environment." Jessica didn't respond to that. She didn't need to, since the tension in her shoulders said enough. She was our friend, but the corporation employee in her seemed to rankle at the idea that people in the city weren't as dependent on the system she worked for anymore. It was understandable, since that's how she made her living. I stepped forward when the line moved, taking a plate when it was offered, and letting the person behind the table pile it with food. My attention stayed on the people, the way they interacted with each other, on the way they talked about the wells like they were already a certainty. They didn't even consider that there was a possibility that they wouldn't get them. Their voices were full of hope and certainty. Once I had my plate, I stepped aside, moving toward one of the standing tables set near the edge of the space that Mayroon had held for us. Alan followed immediately, with Jessica right behind him, the three of us forming a loose triangle as we settled in. Alan laughed as I began to inhale my food. One thing that had never changed throughout my lifetimes was my love for all the different flavors and styles of food available in modern and futuristic worlds. Dig in, why don't you? Alan cackled. Sit and spin, I said, as I simultaneously flipped him off and bit down on a mouthful of paella. Jessica snickered, like you didn't know she was going to enjoy herself when there was food available here. We enjoyed a chuckle just as a shift in the crowd began. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was noticeable if you were paying attention. Conversations paused, then resumed. People adjust, moving to make space without quite realizing they were doing it, then shifted back into position. There wasn't a need to look to understand who had just arrived. His presence wove through the crowd naturally. David moved through the mass of people like he belonged there, smiling, patting shoulders, and shaking the occasional hand as he passed. Watching him reminded me of the natural, grounded charisma my grandfather had. His welcoming smile and the way he engaged people by looking them in the eyes was infectious. People couldn't help but be drawn to him. He was a natural leader, a born politician who knew how to play to the best in people. He knew how to interact with them and how to encourage their best tendencies within a single moment. I watched him move to a food stand, grab a plate, and immediately engage with the people running it. Within a few moments, they were laughing, smiling, and barking with positivity. Jessica's jaw tightened slightly. Of course he's here. The venom in her voice was unmistakable. Didn't take him long to become the center of attention, Alan mused, his mirthful tone diffused somewhat. Neither of them had accepted David over the years. They still believed he was pretending to be me, the original me. The person they had known in our first lives. They knew him as Seven, the man who had tried to kill us on multiple occasions, who had ruined multiple lifetimes with his vindictive and cruel nature. They didn't accept him in this world because they were waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for his cruelty to show itself. The fact that he looked like I did in my first life, if indeed it had been my first life and not his, only made them more paranoid and skeptical about his motivations. A wolf in sheep's clothing. Once he was done getting food, he turned, plate in hand, and walked directly toward us. Alan grinned. You think he practices his entrances? No, I replied instantly, knowing full well it wasn't practiced. Don't encourage him either way, Jessica muttered. David stopped at the edge of the table, glancing between the three of us and giving Mayroon an acknowledging flick of his gaze before he settled on me. Merida, he greeted, like we'd parted minutes ago instead of however long it had been. David, I replied, matching his tone and smiling while shoving down the bile that rose in my throat every time as I addressed him as if he were the actual me. He tilted his head slightly, taking in the space around us, the people, the lights, the quiet hum of nearby conversations. Walk with me? I didn't bother hesitating. I simply grabbed my plate and stood. Sure. I didn't know what he wanted to discuss, but it was clear he'd rather do it away from where other people around us might hear. Alan and Jessica followed suit, grabbing their plates and following. Mayroon was immediately by my side. He knew how I felt about David, and was making a point of being there for me. He led us toward a quieter corner, one where the lights didn't quite reach as strongly, and the crowd thinned just enough to give the illusion of privacy. We stopped near the edge of the artificial grass, where the real ground showed through in uneven patches. For a few moments, no one spoke, just observed the crowd. David took a bite of his food, chewing slowly as he looked back out over the fundraiser. It's working. I followed his gaze out over the crowd. It seems to be. He hummed softly as he took another bite. No, it's working exactly the way it's supposed to. The way I figured it would if you were allowed to set it all up, Alan snorted. Don't make it sound like an ominous plan or anything. David's lips curled into that superior smirk of his. It's only ominous if you think efficiency is something to be afraid of. Why? Jessica crossed her arms in a snap. Depends on who it's efficient for. David didn't bother looking at her as he answered. For everyone, eventually. If we can let it grow. There was something in the way he said it that made my attention sharpen. He looked down at me. You always do this, you know. I glanced up at him. Do what? He gestured faintly with his fork toward the space in front of us. This, he said. You take something broken, something inefficient, something people have just accepted as the way things are, and you make it better. Is that a crime? Alan asked. No, David chuckled. It's not. He took another bite, swallowed, then continued, like he hadn't been interrupted. You didn't take control this time, he went on. Not directly anyway. You didn't step in and declare, this was how things would be, or put yourself in charge. You didn't make people follow you, but here they all are anyway. His gaze shifted back to me, steady and unblinking. You built something that works, something better than they had before, and you had them choose it. I felt something tighten in my chest. It's called helping. Is it? He asked lightly. Jessica frowned. Where are you going with this? David ignored her. Fallout, the wasteland, he said, like he was listing something obvious. You rebuilt structure where there wasn't any, gave people a way to live that didn't revolve around scraping by day to day. My stomach dropped slightly, but he didn't pause. In Thedas, he continued, you created an entirely new caste, which people could use to move into positions of influence. And in Westeros, you created infrastructure and incentives to push society forward through mutual trade and cooperation. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Now here, he said, gesturing once more to the fundraiser, and the people moving through a space because of choices I'd made. Infrastructure, culture, a rising new philosophy. He let the word hang for a moment. Samey pattern, he finished. That's I started, then stopped. I shook my head slightly. That's not the same thing, isn't it? He asked. I'm not running anything, I said more firmly this time. I'm not telling people what to do. I'm not forcing them into anything. I'm showing them how things can be done, and they're choosing to do it. David smiled, not mockingly, not even dismissively. It was that knowing smile he'd get when he had reached a conclusion no one else had. Choice doesn't mean you have freedom. Sound bend. Alan shifted beside me. That's a stretch. Is it? David asked, glancing at him briefly, before returning his attention to me. If one option works and the others don't, or don't work nearly as well, how much of a choice is it, really? I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it again. That's not what I'm doing, I said finally. I'm giving people tools, options, ways they can improve their lives, and they take them, David agreed. Because they work, it saves them money, gives them fulfilling work, and helps them feel a better sense of accomplishment and community. He stepped a little closer, not enough to be invasive, but just enough that his presence felt heavier. And they take them because they work better and feel better than anything else available. They don't even necessarily make their lives easier or more predictable, but because they're healthier and bring personal satisfaction. His voice stayed calm, measured, so that everything he said held weight. You didn't remove a system or shut one down. You offered a new one. They replaced others with which they could be in control of. I'm not trying to replace anything, I said, though even to my own ears, it sounded weaker than I wanted it to. No, David asked. Maybe not, but you are trying to fix things. He tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that felt far too perceptive. You see a problem, and leaving it alone isn't an option for you. You have to fix it. It's like an impulse with you. It's instinctive. You probably can't even help it. That's not a flaw, I said as something in my chest tightened. I never said it was, David agreed. Then what are you saying? Jessica cut in, her frustration with his presence, and the way he was speaking to me finally pushing through. David glanced at her, then back to me. I'm saying she did exactly what we all expected her to do. Left to her own devices, she put herself in a position where she could affect change. She didn't accidentally build this movement. She didn't stumble into a position of influence. She's not creating these outcomes by mistake. His gaze held mine. You're doing exactly what everyone expects you to do by now. The words settled in slowly. I swallowed, my mind trying to push back against something that felt uncomfortably familiar. I'm just trying to help, I said again, quieter this time. I know, David replied. Somehow, that made it worse. He straightened slightly, looking back out over the people who were laughing and talking and planning for something better than what they had. And you're doing a great job, it's working, just like it always does. He paused, then added almost as an afterthought. And it's going to keep working whether you're here or not. That thought. I didn't like that thought. Or maybe I just didn't like the way he said it. I crossed my arms, more out of instinct than anything else. That's the point, I said. It's supposed to continue. It's supposed to help people even after I'm gone. David nodded slowly, of course. There was a beat of silence, then he softly added, but don't pretend that means you're not responsible for it. And don't pretend you're not the influence behind it all, even if you don't want people to see you that way. You can't start something and expect people not to credit you with it. That landed harder than I wanted it to. I looked away, my gaze drifting back to the crowd, to the way they were discussing the wells, the plans being made, the lives being quietly and excitedly reshaped. I had wanted this. It's what I had been working towards for over a decade. And now I could quite tell where my intentions ended and the system I had set in place began. Anyway, I pulled you here to say that I think you did a great job, David said, and that I'm curious to see where you will go from here. I took a deep breath and let the expectation he had settle in my chest. He expected more, but was it because he knew I would want to refine what was in place? Or because he knew, like he'd said, that I would see another problem and be compelled to fix it as well? Was any of this a choice on my part? Could I even resist making things better if I want to? What would that do to me mentally if I did? Deep down, I was afraid of finding out the answer to that question.